Okay, so this video may be a little longer than average because we have to define the various terms and definitions that we will be discussing. So for those who already know what these terms mean, I apologize for the reiteration. Now, this video will discuss MMT, aka Modern Monetary Theory. This one is particularly interesting because this is a very favorited market-based economic system that is mostly supported by those on the left. So I think it's important to understand what modern monetary theory is all about, and if it is practical. So let's begin. So in essence, MMT is the idea that we can use fiat money, which is paper money not backed by anything, created through the Federal Reserve to systematically increase government entitlements and other programs without ever running out of money. Since the government creates its own fiat currency from the Federal Reserve, which is the US's central bank, they can continually print as much money as they want to afford any type of government program or entitlement that they want. There is one major issue with this, however, and that is that the government doesn't own the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is a privately owned bank, owned by banks, and pays dividends on its shares owned only by banks. This means that although the US government works with the Federal Reserve, it does not have much control of monetary policy, as MMT advocates like to believe. If you are curious on how we know that the government doesn't own the Fed, please watch the video in the description. But for the sake of this video, let's assume that the US does indeed own the Federal Reserve. So what are some examples of how we could use MMT? In theory, we could use MMT to create a job for every single person in the country. Since the US dollar does not have intrinsic value, we can, in theory, create as much fiat currency as we want, since there is no limit to the amount we can create. And then we can afford to create massive amounts of stimulus budgets to create massive amounts of jobs. Not having intrinsic value simply means that the dollar is not backed by gold, silver, or other commodities that have inherent worth. It is backed by the credit of the US government. This is a fancy way of saying it is backed by the US guaranteeing it will pay back its debt. So in a nutshell, government credit just means a verbal guarantee of debt remittance. I say verbal guarantee because if every US Treasury bondholder would all of a sudden liquidate their bonds, the US would have to default on its debt, meaning they wouldn't have enough money to pay off the Treasury bondholders throughout the world, and the Federal Reserve would have to implement hyperinflation to pay back the debt, which would most likely collapse the US economy. So there is a possibility that the US wouldn't immediately pay back their debt due to the subsequent economic collapse that would follow. But here's where it gets interesting. The US and the Federal Reserve are already implementing modern monetary theory to some degree. The most popular form of MMT that the US is doing is its monetization for the offset of our trade imbalance. A trade imbalance derives from a country importing a greater value of goods than it exports. So in other words, it spends more than it earns in international trade. And just like in business or in your personal life, you cannot spend more than you earn indefinitely because you will eventually go broke. To fix this, you would have to achieve higher earnings or sell more assets to offset the imbalance or counterfeit money, reduce spending, and things of that nature. The US government counterfeits its money. So what does that mean? Am I saying that the US is creating fake currency to pay off the trade imbalance? No, not in the traditional sense, that is. The counterfeit option can only be used if a country's currency is considered the medium currency for international trade. Medium means the most common form of currency exchange, which is the case within the United States. The IMF, or International Monetary Fund, recognizes the US as a safe place to invest. It recognizes the US dollar as the most recognizable currency in the world for trade and international business. What this means is that the US can just print and use fiat currency for every trade derivative or international business financing adventure that it wants to, and other countries will accept it, since other countries have no choice but to accept it, due to the US maintaining global fiscal dominance. Since the demand from foreigners is seemingly limitless, the Federal Reserve is able to create massive amounts of fiat currency to finance our trade deficits with other countries, which no other nation in the world could hope to accomplish. The truth of the matter is that the US is not hurt by a trade deficit. We are actually the benefactors, while our trading partners are the victims. We get the fancy cars, the TV sets, and luxury items, while they get the counterfeit money. The US can do this so long as other countries continue to want to use the US dollar. But when the time comes and other countries no longer want access to the US currency, the dollar will collapse, and hundreds of billions of dollars that is resting in foreign countries will quickly come back to the US as people everywhere in the world attempt to convert the now worthless dollar into tangible products, and to do so as soon as possible before the dollar becomes even more worthless. Which brings us back to MMT. MMT says that the national debt is the total amount of currency circulating in the US economy. And this is completely true. All the money in our economy is created through fractional reserve banking, meaning all currency in the economy is created out of debt. Moreover, since all the currency in our economy is created out of debt, it is impossible to completely pay the debt back because our economy will collapse due to the removal of the money supply in the economy. So for those who don't understand fractional reserve banking, here's a very quick explanation. Commercial banks have to maintain a certain percentage of reserve currency in their facilities. We will say 10%, but this mandate is adjustable. So it could be 5%, 20, etc., etc. So let's say a bank has $1 million in reserves in its facility. They only have to keep 10% in their facility, which means they are able to loan out the other 90%, or in this case, $900,000. So let's say the bank lends out the other 90% to numerous people. What happens is that the bank lends the money out to different people, and they charge interest on the loan. They have now artificially increased the money supply, because when that loan is paid back, it will be greater than its original value of $900,000 due to the newly added interest. This is called making money from debt, and explains how our economy is comprised of money created from this artificial maneuver. Okay, so you may be getting confused here and wondering how this all fits together. So let's connect the dots. In order for MMT to be implemented in a more broader approach, the Federal Reserve would have to continually print more and more fiat currency so they can finance all of the programs and budget components that the US wants. This massive amount of inflation will continually devalue the US dollar. Today, the US dollar has lost 96% of its purchasing power, meaning the dollar has 96% less worth than it did in 1913. And this will only continue to get worse. The more money that is printed, the more inflation we will experience, and the more our dollar will devalue until eventually foreign governments and citizens will lose faith in the US dollar, meaning the credit of the US will no longer be accepted and the US will default on all of its debt. We will no longer be able to print our way out of debt, like we can do now with our trade imbalance. Once our dollar is completely worthless, printing more money won't do any good, since nobody is using the dollar anymore for its medium of exchange. Now, some people will say that this will never happen, that the US dollar will always be number one in the world. But this is wishful thinking. It only takes one war to go bad. It only takes a country like China to cash in our treasury bonds. It only takes the EU to lose confidence in America. There are numerous possibilities that could damage US credit. So in conclusion, although MMT sounds good in theory, the practicality leaves much to be desired. The dollar will continue to devalue, and when the day comes and the US currency is no longer recognized as the most sound currency in the world, which will inevitably happen, and foreign investors step away from America, the political and economic ramifications that would manifest from this abdication would destroy the US economy and put us into a severe depression, worse than we saw in the 1930s. But there is a way to utilize the benefits of fiat currency that would completely pay off our national debt and deficit. We could end the Federal Reserve. We have to end the Federal Reserve, always. No matter what happens, we have to end the Fed. But we could end the Federal Reserve, and by doing this, the US will no longer have to pay interest on every bond we sell to the Fed, nor will our national debt continue to accumulate interest due to the interests being compounded. We could end fractional reserve banking. and mandate that banks have 100% reserves in their facilities. Then we could transfer all monetary policy to the Treasury Department with regulations on how much inflation can be allowed. Then we can pay back our national debt and deficit in no time and still have the benefits of fiat currency, like the trade imbalance. Another option is to go back to the gold standard, but before the implementation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, not the gold standard up to 1971. Either way, we desperately need a new monetary revolution to stop the corrupt monetary system we currently reside in. Whether we choose MMT, gold standard, or debt-free money is open for debate, but we desperately need to end the Federal Reserve and end this deeply corrupt system that controls the U.S. economy and damages the sanctity of its citizens. It is time to stop plutocrats controlling this country. If you like what you see, please consider subscribing and being a patron. The Piper Report is an alternative news source that discusses topics you won't hear from the corporate media, and a special thanks to my patrons. And I'm done.